Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this analytical corner session on building tax capacity in developing countries. If you weren't here before, my name is Salsa Mazlan. I work at the IMF Communications Department, and I'll be your moderator for today. So before I invite my colleagues, Charles Vellutini and Juan Carlos Benitez, onto the stage, just a few housekeeping rules. Make sure your phones are on silent. We'll have a 10-minute presentation from them, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So without further ado, please welcome Charles and Juan Carlos.
Ending poverty in every form, everywhere, ending hunger, achieving food security, ensuring inclusive education, achieving gender parity, reducing inequality, and combating climate change. These are goals we can all agree on. In fact, in 2015, the world committed to achieving these goals by adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
To achieve these sustainable development goals, it has been estimated that emerging markets and developing economies need around $3 trillion in additional spending. In a context where many countries are at high risk of debt distress, domestic revenue mobilization has never been more critical. Hi, my name is Juan Carlos Benitez.
And I'm Charles Vellutini. We are both senior economists at the Fiscal Affairs Department, and we are pleased to welcome you to this analytical corners on building tax capacity in developing countries. Let us start by looking at how much it will take to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in some selected economies. Okay? For the 4 countries shown here, the necessary resources to pursue these goals vary from 21.3% of GDP in Rwanda to 8.1% in Cambodia. On average, reaching the Sustainable Development Goal will require developing countries to mobilize an additional 16% of GDP per year. In a situation of high debt and elevated interest rates, tax revenue is a vital resource to address this challenge. So, Juan Carlos, how are developing countries performing in terms of raising tax revenue?
Thank you, Charles. That is a good question. To answer this, we have grouped countries into 3 categories: advanced economies, or AEs, emerging markets, or EMs, and low-income developing countries, or LIDCs. We have then plotted their tax GDP ratios over time. By doing so, we see that low-income developing countries currently and on average collect around 13.8% of GDP, which is 3.5 percentage points higher than what they collected 3 decades ago. This is a modest improvement if we consider the size of the challenge ahead of us and that revenue has been mostly flat since the financial crisis. But averages conceal many successful cases of countries that have been able to improve their tax intakes substantively over the course of the past 3 decades. The Maldives, for example, was able to increase its tax to GDP ratio from around 20% in 2010 to close to 30% in 2022. This is a very large increase that resulted from undertaking bold reforms. It demonstrates that securing additional revenue is achievable.
Indeed, countries still have a large untapped tax potential. We have estimated that developing countries could mobilize approximately 6.9% of GDP in additional revenue. This estimation was derived through cross-country comparisons, accounting for the characteristics of each individual country. Furthermore, we run simulations where we assume that low-income countries can reach emerging markets' level of government effectiveness. We then re-estimated the tax potential, and we got an additional 2.3% of GDP. So in total, we have estimated potential additional revenue of 9% of GDP. This figure represents a significant step covering half the distance needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. It really pays off to invest in tax capacity. So Juan Carlos, how do we reform?
Let's start with the design of taxes. Much attention has been devoted to the problems of international taxation during the last years, and these problems are surely important. However, strengthening domestic taxes is at least, if not more vital to developing and emerging economies. In fact, countries that have successfully mobilized revenue have simplified their tax systems. They have eliminated small and inefficient taxes and focused on a few core taxable bases, such as consumption, income, and real property. And they have broadened these tax bases, often without increasing tax rates. Broadening tax bases first implies streamlining ineffective tax expenditures. These are the myriad of tax exemptions and incentives that plague many tax systems. Some of these tax exemptions are well justified, especially when they address market failures such as those related to research and development, or externalities such as climate change concerns. However, as we can see on the left chart, the scope for reform is significant. In low-income developing countries, tax expenditures account for almost 25% of tax revenue, and the value-added tax contributes a large share of that. Second, broadening tax bases means coping with tax compliance gaps. On the right chart, we see estimates of value-added tax compliance gaps, and here too, there is a lot of room for improvement. For example, low-income countries, the compliance gap has been estimated at as much as 50% of the potential. Charles, can you walk us through one of the key core tax bases?
Sure, Juan Carlos. Let's focus on taxing consumption. The value-added tax, VAT, can be extremely effective in revenue mobilization. It accounts for over 6% of GDP and is dominant in economies that made it above the 15% tax ratio, as shown in orange on the left. Concerns about the regressivity of the VAT are relevant, but regressivity or progressivity should be assessed in the context of the overall taxation and spending system. And VAT exemptions, which erode the tax base, are high cost and blunt redistributive instruments. Carefully designed benefit programs directly targeted at the needy can be much more efficient. Excise taxes can also be better used in low-income countries, both to raise revenue and reduce the impact of negative externalities. Fuel excises are a form of carbon pricing long implemented in developing countries. But the rates are still set low, and differentiation across product types are not reflecting their carbon content or health impact. So, as shown on the right, there is a lot of potential to increase revenue for excises while contributing to climate-related objectives. But Juan Carlos, aside from revenue generation, let's discuss the other goals of a well-functioning tax system.
Certainly, progressivity of tax systems also matters. Developing countries, like other countries, must ensure equitable taxation to address rising income inequality. It's important to stress that equity and perceived fairness in taxation are crucial in boosting tax acceptance and tax morale. So, how are countries doing in this regard? Here, we show the redistributive power of taxes and transfers, which is measured by the change in the Gini coefficient of income before and after taxes and transfers. Each dot represents a country. Little redistribution is achieved in developing countries. This is shown by the orange dots, which stay very close to the diagonal line of no change in Gini coefficients. In contrast, other development groups achieved a substantial reduction in inequality, particularly in advanced economies, the blue dots. In parts, these differences in progressivity correspond to differences in tax composition, as shown on the right chart. In developing countries, the personal income tax, which does the heavy lifting in the progressivity of the tax system, has a limited role. collecting only 2% of GDP in revenue on average. In this same vein, property taxes, shown in red here, remain an untapped source of revenue potential in developing countries. Property taxes are simple to collect once the appropriate infrastructure is in place, such as a cadaster, and can support the progressivity of the tax system too. So Charles, what about revenue institutions?
Right. Yeah, finally, let's turn to tax administration. Significant revenue mobilization has seldom been achieved by tax policy changes alone. Improving tax collection and compliance is essential. As shown here, in low-income countries that significantly increase revenue, key measures in tax administration have been establishing risk-based auditing, good governance, human resource policy and information system within the administration, and strengthening taxpayer segmentation. For example, it pays to have a large taxpayer unit in place. These steps are essential to address the compliance gaps we discussed before. Let's emphasize that tax capacity is not merely concerned with generating revenue. That's important. It's equally about supporting domestic institutions and state capacity at large, which is crucial for autonomous development. So, what are our main takeaways? First, it's estimated that developing countries need an additional 16% of GDP in spending to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. With many countries facing high debt risk, increasing domestic revenue through taxation is essential. Second, and on a positive note here, our estimates indicate that there is an untapped tax potential of around 9% of GDP on average. This represents a significant opportunity to generate the required resources. Third, we have reported that by focusing on core domestic taxes and by investing in revenue administrations, these are key strategies to mobilize this potential. We invite you to download the IMF staff discussion note on building tax capacity in developing countries, where all these points are analyzed in more depth. You have a QR code here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Charles and Juan Carlos, for this very important presentation. Let's turn to you for questions. Yes, could we have this gentleman in the third row? There's someone. Please again state your name, your affiliation, and try to keep your questions short. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Arne Vogels from MasterCard. Really good presentation. I like the insights. How much do you think that a cashless society could help drive more transparency and could help with the policy guidelines or recommendations that you and findings that you have in these in your analysis?
Thank you. I will say that does go beyond the scope of today's research and presentation, but we appreciate your interest and we'll be moving on. Could we go to the gentleman at the back? Oh, sorry, right at the back.
Hi, Mustafa Ndajo from Niger State Government. So my question is on the tax expenditures, looking at VAT. We know that, for example, in low-income developing countries, you have significant expenditures towards things like basic food items, and these are things that are consumed by mostly low-income. It's consumed by everyone, but you have a significant population of low-income people. And so if you're advocating for less tax expenditure, how do you address this vis-a-vis issues of inequality, poverty, and whatnot? Yeah.
I can take this. No, thank you. This is a very, very important topic that we have to deal with in many countries. So we briefly mentioned this in the presentation, but in two sentences. it is true that these exemptions, especially on foodstuff, as you rightly pointed out, do help the poor, and that's important, right? So that needs to be understood. On the other hand, they are very blunt, these exemptions, in the sense that, in fact, the higher income taxpayers capture most of the value expansion from the tax expansion. So a better policy that some countries have implemented is to target directly the poor, the needy, with, whenever possible, direct subsidies or transfer to them. And by removing the tax expenditure on VATs that currently benefit mostly the higher income and the wealthy, you will get more than enough revenue to fund such programs.
Thank you. Could we go on that side? The gentleman at the back. Thank you.
Hello, Dhruv Patel, Sincurrent.
Would you mind standing up?
Oh.
Thanks.
Hello, Dhruv Patel, Sincurrent. This may go beyond the scope of your research, but just curious, are North American tribes part of your data set? And if not, how would you categorize them, if not developing countries?
That's really beyond the scope. I don't think I can comment on that. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I mean, we get cross-country data, right? Aggregate data. So yes, as Charles rightly pointed out, that would be out of the scope.
Thank you. Yes, this gentleman right here. A mic is being passed down.
Tony Carroll with the Carnegie Endowment. I'm going to push a little bit about property tax potential in lower developing LDICs. Many LDICs are marked by informal settlements, and land identification, classification is still very much an aspiration than a reality. I think certainly in commercial real estate, the potential is certainly there to increase property tax revenues, but I'm a little wondering whether or not a lot of investment has to be in to establish the right infrastructure so that you will be able to establish a base for property income increases.
I can take it. Maybe Juan Carlos, you will share his experience very briefly. Very good question, absolutely critical. No, you're right. I mean, in many developing countries, you first need institutional prerequisite, a cadastre, as I think we said. Now, the potential, this is a long-term, medium-term goal, right? This is not you will get typically in your African or developing countries a short-term revenue on the property tax. However, in terms of equity, it's important to pursue this. And in terms of revenue mobilization, once the institutions are in place, it is relatively straightforward and difficult to evade because this is a physical asset we're talking about. So yes, this is something that really an important goal, but we see that in some countries more as a medium-term goal, but still an important one.
Yes, I mean, I would only add to that as we point out in our paper, institutional reform has to be complemented also by tax policy reforms, right? And they have to go hand in hand to achieve precisely what Charles already alluded to.
Thank you. Could we have this gentleman in the second row here? Oh, sure. Yeah, you've been waiting for a while. I'll get you after. Thank you. Sorry.
Hi. So have you done any analysis on sort of the cost of implementing, building up the tax capacity? The reason why I state this is because oftentimes the burden is felt by the compliant firms because at least in LIDCs, you actually have a huge percentage of the population outside of the tax net. And then the government tends to go after the really compliant firms, and that sort of discourages foreign investment in the future, right? So is there sort of an analysis on which sort of intervention is more effective? Like, is it better to invest in the IT systems? Is it better to invest in more audits? Because certainly, audits are pretty problematic for compliant firms. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. That is certainly a concern for tax systems in terms of broadening the tax base. What we have seen and our paper shows is that countries that have invested in digitalization have managed to improve their revenue mobilization without any changes in tax policy. We also show in the staff discussion note that those countries that focused on better compliance risk, that is, on taxpayer segmentation, were able to better target those taxpayers that were non-compliant. So I think that it's a very broad problem, but I think that the experience that we have observed showcases that these type of interventions can be useful in tackling the problem of informality that, of course, goes beyond the issues of taxation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we'll go with the gentleman who's been patiently waiting for a while.
Thank you. David Barroso with Young Diplomats of Canada. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned personal income tax as an area of huge potential. I'm curious how informal sectors factor into that analysis and your assessment of that potential.
Yeah, no, excellent questions. The informal sector is a very important topic in economic development, in taxation particularly. Gradually bringing more people and more small business into the fiscal, the tax net is a very critical and important process. It will not happen overnight. It is important to lower the entry costs into the system and provide the right incentives. So have simplified tax system for the small micro enterprise, for the self-employed. That's extremely important. Have a low compliance cost to start with, and then let those enterprises and small businesses grow with the system. But it's a little bit like property tax. It's a very important goal. We do not think it can happen overnight in a number of low-income countries, but it's a question of make it possible, or let me rephrase that the tax system must be compatible with informal actors willing to enter the system with a very low cost.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so let's go to this gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you for the presentation. I don't think I'm out of scope. What we saw in taxation, while a lot of in the low-income countries, they are producing natural resources, and the investments of multinationals in those countries, you see a lot of tax exceptions are being made for those investments. Is there some correlation between building tax capacity and those exemptions?
Again. No, this is completely in scope. Thank you. No, absolutely. What was mentioned, but very briefly, of course, it's in the paper, is that investment incentives, right, can be extremely costly, can be benefiting sometimes overly foreign investors and large enterprises, as opposed to small businesses that often form the core and the backbone of many of these economies. And so this is another reason why you should be careful, and you want to really evaluate those tax expenditures, those incentives, and make sure you get something in return, and if not, reform them. So this is clearly alongside VAT, and we had another question on that. Tax investment incentives can be very costly and can play to the tax competition among developing countries that can be very harmful, and this is something that needs to be carefully evaluated.
Yes, I would just add that the milestone encompassing the global minimum tax, which puts a 15% minimum tax rate with several complexities surrounding this, should be an opportunity for low-income developing countries to make their tax, to ensure that their tax incentives are not redundant, right? And that they are not seeding tax base. That's the only thing I would add to Charles' response.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for our Q&A session today. Again, you can download their paper here. Thank you to you all for joining us, and thank you, Charles and Juan Carlos.